At the Tokyo World Martial Arts Expo, a 15-year-old aikido black belt named Kenji Watanabe was about to perform a respectful sparring demonstration. A celebration of martial traditions turned deadly when MMA superstar Damian Vega broke the rules and Kenji's guard with a brutal punch meant to humiliate. Seagal wasn't your typical spectator. For over 5 decades, he had been an aikido master, Hollywood action star, and the controversial figure who'd turned martial philosophy into blockbuster entertainment, renowned not just for his film career but for his unshakable dedication to traditional combat principles. When Vega mocked tradition and struck a child for viral clout, he had no idea he was about to face a master who had spent a lifetime perfecting the art of redirecting aggression. Seagal stepped onto the mat with quiet purpose, delivering a precise lesson in humility that would echo far beyond the convention center. What began as a staged cultural exchange would become a generational reckoning. The martial arts world and Vega himself would never forget the day Seagal reminded everyone that true mastery isn't about domination, it's about discipline. Before we jump back and tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Tokyo World Martial Arts Expo sprawled across the massive convention center like a living tapestry of combat disciplines. Traditional dojos had set up modest displays alongside flashy promotional booths from major fighting organizations. The air hummed with the sounds of different languages, the sharp crack of wooden weapons, and the rhythmic thud of heavy bags being worked. Fluorescent lights cast everything in stark relief, highlighting the contrast between ancient traditions and modern spectacle. In the main preparation area, 15-year-old Kenji Watanabe sat cross-legged on a thin mat, his breathing carefully controlled. His white gi was immaculate, the black belt around his waist tied with precise symmetry. Despite his youth, there was something old-world about his posture, the kind of discipline that came from years of bowing to tradition rather than cameras. "Remember, Kenji-kun," Master Hiroshi Saito said softly, settling beside his student, with the fluid grace of someone who had spent decades perfecting the art of movement. At 73, Sato's hair was silver white, but his eyes remained sharp as obsidian. Today is not about winning or losing. It is about demonstrating the heart of aikido, redirecting aggression, not meeting it with force. Kenji nodded, though his hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his belt for the 3rd time. "Hi, sensei, but there will be so many people watching. And my opponent." He paused, uncertainty flickering across his young features. "Damian Vega is a professional fighter. What if I embarrass our dojo?" Master Sato's weathered hand rested gently on Kenji's shoulder. "The only way to embarrass our dojo would be to abandon what we have taught you. Your technique is sound, your spirit is pure. Trust in that." Across the arena, the atmosphere couldn't have been more different. Damian Vega's entourage had transformed a simple booth into what looked like a mobile command center. Cameras tracked his every movement as he shadowboxed for his social media team, his muscled frame moving with predatory precision. At 28, he was in peak physical condition, 6 feet 2 inches of sculpted aggression, his arms and torso decorated with elaborate tattoos that told the story of his rise from Chicago's roughest neighborhoods. "This is perfect content, baby," Marco Diaz, his promoter, shouted over the noise, his designer suit somehow managing to look both expensive and gaudy. "You're about to show these traditional arts dinosaurs what real fighting looks like. The video's gonna go viral before you even leave the mat." Damian grinned, his teeth white against his olive skin. Kid probably doesn't even know what hit him yet. These aikido guys, they're all about that flowery dance stuff. Wait till he meets some real power. His training partners laughed, but there was something desperate in Damian's bravado, a hunger that went beyond simple confidence. He'd clawed his way out of poverty through his fists, and every fight, every appearance was a chance to prove he belonged in the spotlight. The likes, the shares, the viral moments, they were validation that his brutal childhood had led to something meaningful. Near the VIP entrance, a different kind of energy rippled through the crowd. Seagal had arrived, though few immediately recognized him. Gone was the flashy action hero persona. Instead, he moved with the quiet authority of someone who had nothing left to prove. At 71, His hair was silver and pulled back in a simple ponytail, his black clothing understated but expensive. He carried himself with the particular stillness that came from decades of aikido training, present but not imposing, aware but not aggressive. He paused at Master Sato's booth, where traditional calligraphy scrolls hung beside faded photographs of students from decades past. Their eyes met across the crowded space, and Sato's face lit up with genuine surprise and pleasure. "Seagal-san," Saito said, rising and offering a deep bow. "I did not expect to see you here." "Saito-sensei," Seagal replied, returning the bow with equal respect. "I needed to reconnect with my roots. Hollywood makes you forget what's real." The old master smiled, understanding passing between them without words. "You have chosen a good day for it. Though I fear the demonstration may not be what either of us hoped." Seagal's dark eyes tracked across the arena, taking in the cameras, the promotional banners, the way tradition and commerce uneasily shared space. "The art endures," he said simply, "even when we lose sight of it." Meanwhile, investigative journalist Emi Nakamura moved through the crowd with practiced efficiency, her camera crew following at a respectful distance. At 35, she had the keen eyes of someone who had spent years looking beneath the surface of martial arts culture. Her own judo career had ended with a knee injury that still ached in cold weather, but it had taught her to see the politics and personalities that shaped combat sports. "The story isn't just about the demonstration," she told her cameraman, adjusting her press badge. "Look at the demographics. The traditional crowd is older, more respectful. The MMA fans are younger, louder, hungrier for excitement. This whole expo is a powder keg waiting for a spark." She paused near Damian's booth, where Marco was orchestrating an impromptu interview session. "You know what I love about this kid from the Aikido dojo?" Damian was saying, his voice carrying over the crowd noise. "He's got heart." "That's cute." "Heart doesn't stop a right hook, but it's cute." His entourage laughed on cue, but Emmy noticed something else. A group of young students from local dojos had gathered to watch, their faces showing a mixture of excitement and unease. They wore the simple uniforms of their respective arts, their belts indicating years of dedicated training. To them, this wasn't entertainment. It was a representation of everything they'd been taught to respect. "This could get ugly," Emmy murmured to her cameraman. "Keep rolling no matter what happens." As the official demonstration time approached, the energy in the arena shifted. Conversations quieted, people moved toward the central mat, and the house lights dimmed to focus attention on the exhibition space. Kenji emerged from the preparation area, moving with the careful precision of someone who had been taught that every gesture mattered. His bow to the empty mat was deep and genuine, a gesture of respect that had been drilled into him since childhood. Damian's entrance was everything Kenji's wasn't. Music pounded from the speakers as he jogged onto the mat, his movements loose and confident. He played to the cameras, flexing for the crowd, his grin wide and predatory. When he reached the center of the mat, he looked down at Kenji with an expression somewhere between amusement and contempt. "This is going to be fun," he said, loud enough for the front row to hear. In the VIP section, Steven Seagal settled into his seat, his expression unreadable. Master Saito sat nearby, his hands folded in his lap, watching his student with the quiet intensity of someone who had invested years in another person's development. The moment balanced on a knife's edge, tradition and modernity, respect and spectacle, all waiting to see which would prevail when the demonstration began. The arena fell into an expectant hush as the official demonstration commenced. Kenji stepped forward, his movements flowing like water, each gesture deliberate and meaningful. He performed a series of basic aikido forms, Tai no Henko, Ikkyo, and Irimi Nage, his body language speaking of years spent learning to redirect force rather than meet it head-on. The traditional crowd watched with appreciation, recognizing the precision and control required for such seemingly simple movements. Damian, meanwhile, bounced on the balls of his feet, his MMA training evident in every gesture. Where Kenji moved with circular fluidity, Damian's body language was all sharp angles and explosive potential. He threw casual jabs at the air, rolled his shoulders, and shot grins at the cameras that tracked his every movement. "Look at this kid," Damian said, his voice carrying clearly through the arena's sound system. All that fancy footwork. Very pretty. But what happens when someone doesn't want to dance? He reached out suddenly, tapping Kenji lightly on the forehead with his gloved hand. It was meant to look playful, but there was something predatory in the gesture, a lion batting at a mouse. The crowd's reaction split immediately. The MMA fans cheered and laughed, while the traditional martial artists shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Kenji's face flushed with embarrassment, but he maintained his composure. This was part of the test, he told himself. Master Saito had warned him that some fighters would try to break his focus, to make him abandon his training. In favor of ego, he breathed deeply, centering himself, and continued his demonstration. Patience, Kenji-kun, Master Saito whispered from the sidelines, though his voice couldn't carry over the crowd noise. His weathered hands gripped the edge of his seat as he watched his student navigate the increasingly hostile environment. Damian circled Kenji like a predator, his movements becoming more aggressive. He threw a lazy jab that stopped just short of Kenji's nose, then laughed when the young man instinctively stepped back. "Come on, kid. Where's that famous aikido magic? Show me how you're going to redirect this." He threw another punch, this one closer, and Kenji responded with a perfect irimi movement, stepping off the line of attack and positioning himself for a potential counter. But instead of following through with the technique, he simply returned to his ready position, maintaining the peaceful intent of the demonstration. "Boring," someone shouted from the MMA section of the crowd. "Hit him back." Emi Nakamura watched through her camera lens, her journalist instincts screaming that this was spiraling out of control. "This isn't a demonstration anymore," she whispered to her cameraman. "This is a setup. Vega's trying to provoke the kid into fighting." In the VIP section, Steven Seagal's expression had shifted from polite interest to focused attention. His dark eyes tracked every movement on the mat, reading the body language of both fighters with the expertise of someone who had spent decades studying human aggression. He could see what was coming, Damian's frustration at not getting the reaction he wanted, the way his movements were becoming less playful and more genuinely threatening. "This is going to go bad," Seagal murmured to himself, his voice barely audible above the crowd noise. On the mat, Damian's patience was wearing thin. The demonstration was supposed to be showcasing the contrast between traditional and modern martial arts, but Kenji's refusal to engage was making him look like a bully. He needed something more dramatic, something that would create the viral moment Marco was constantly pushing for. "You know what, kid?" Damian said, his voice taking on a harder edge. "I think you're scared. All this spiritual warrior stuff. But when it comes down to it, you're just another kid who can't handle real pressure." He moved closer, his presence becoming genuinely intimidating. Kenji could smell his opponent's cologne mixed with the sharp scent of adrenaline. The young Aikidoka's breathing quickened despite his training, primal survival instincts warring with years of discipline. "Show me something real," Damian continued, his voice now carrying a genuine threat. "Stop dancing around and actually defend yourself." In the crowd, the young students from local dojos watched with growing alarm. They recognized what was happening. The careful structure of the demonstration was breaking down, replaced by something far more dangerous. Several of them looked toward their instructors, seeking guidance, but the adults seemed as uncertain as they were. Master Saito rose from his seat, his face etched with concern. This was not what had been agreed upon. The demonstration was meant to be light contact, a showcase of different approaches to martial arts. But Damian's body language spoke of someone building toward genuine violence. "Perhaps we should stop," he called out, but his voice was lost in the crowd noise and the pounding music that continued to blast from the arena speakers. Kenji, meanwhile, found his center despite the pressure. This was exactly what Master Saito had trained him for, maintaining composure under stress, finding peace in the midst of chaos. He moved through another sequence of techniques, his movements, becoming more confident as he remembered his training. "The way of harmony," he whispered to himself, reciting one of the fundamental principles of Aikido. "Turn weakness into strength, aggression into peace." But Damian's frustration was reaching a breaking point. The kid's calm was infuriating, made him look like an amateur bully trying to intimidate a monk. He needed to provoke a reaction, to show that all the traditional arts were just elaborate ways of avoiding real fighting. "Fine," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper that somehow carried through the arena. If you won't fight, I'll just have to show everyone what happens when philosophy meets reality. He stepped back, his stance shifting from playful to predatory. The crowd sensed the change immediately. Conversations died, camera flashes increased, and the tension in the arena became almost palpable. Steven Seagal leaned forward in his seat, his hands resting on his knees. Every instinct he'd developed over decades of training was screaming that violence was imminent. He could see it in Damian's eyes. The fighter had moved beyond demonstration into something far more dangerous. "Stop this," he said quietly, though he knew no one could hear him over the crowd noise. On the mat, Kenji maintained his ready position, but his young face showed the strain of the situation. He was 15 years old, facing a professional fighter who outweighed him by 40 pounds and had years of experience in actual combat. All his training, all his philosophy, was about to be tested in the most brutal way possible. Damian smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Ready, kid? Let's see what your aikido is really worth." The arena fell silent for a heartbeat, the kind of pregnant pause that comes before lightning strikes. Damian's stance shifted subtly, his weight settling into the balls of his feet, shoulders dropping into the relaxed alertness of someone who had spent years learning to hurt people efficiently. The playful facade was gone now, replaced by something far more predatory. Kenji sensed the change immediately. His training kicked in, not the flashy techniques he'd been demonstrating, but the deep-rooted awareness that Master Saito had drilled into him. The space between them felt electric, charged with potential violence. He shifted into a proper defensive stance, hands raised in the classical aikido position, his breathing controlled despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. "That's more like it," Damian said, his voice carrying a note of genuine satisfaction. "Now we're getting somewhere." Without warning, he exploded forward. The first punch came fast, a sharp jab that cut through the air where Kenji's head had been a split second earlier. The young aikidoka's irimi movement was perfect, stepping off the line of attack and positioning himself for a counter. But before he could follow through, Damian's left hook was already coming, then a right cross, then another jab. The combination was brutal in its efficiency, each strike designed to set up the next. Kenji managed to evade the first few strikes, his aikido training serving him well. His movements were fluid, economical, each step calculated to avoid damage while looking for an opening to redirect his opponent's aggression. But Damian was relentless, pressing forward with the kind of sustained assault that had made him famous in the MMA world. "Stop!" Master Saito shouted from the sidelines, but his voice was lost in the sudden roar of the crowd. Half the arena was on its feet, some cheering for the unexpected violence, others crying out in alarm. Emi Nakamura's camera crew captured every moment, but she found herself lowering her microphone, her journalist's objectivity warring with her human instincts. "This isn't right," she whispered. "This isn't what was supposed to happen." On the mat, Kenji was beginning to realize the vast difference between controlled practice and real violence. Damian's strikes carried genuine intent to harm, and the speed and power behind them was unlike anything he'd experienced in his dojo. He managed to deflect a punch with a proper Tenkan movement, but the follow-up elbow caught him in the ribs, driving the air from his lungs. "Come on, kid," Damian taunted, his confidence growing as he saw Kenji's defense beginning to break down. "Where's all that harmony now? Where's the spiritual warrior?" He feinted high and went low, a leg kick that caught Kenji behind the knee and sent him stumbling. Before the young man could recover, Damian was on him, throwing a combination that forced Kenji to abandon technique in favor of pure survival instinct. In the VIP section, Steven Seagal's hands gripped the arms of his chair. He could see what was coming. Kenji's training was excellent, but he was 15 years old facing a professional fighter who had abandoned any pretense of a demonstration. The kid was brave, but bravery without experience was just another word for getting hurt. "This has to stop," he said, his voice carrying a note of command that made the people around him look up. But on the mat, events were accelerating beyond anyone's control. Damian, feeding off the crowd's energy and his own growing confidence, decided to end the demonstration with something spectacular. He stepped back, giving himself room, and loaded up for a punch that would put Kenji down hard and give the cameras the knockout footage they were all waiting for. "Let's wrap this up," he shouted, and threw everything he had behind a right cross that would have felled a grown man. Kenji saw it coming. The telegraphed movement, the overcommit stance. The perfect opening for a classic aikido counter. His training screamed at him to blend with the attack, to use Damian's momentum against him, to transform the aggression into something harmless. For a moment, everything Master Saito had taught him crystallized into perfect clarity. But Damian was faster than anyone Kenji had ever trained with, and the power behind the punch was devastating. The young Aikidoka's attempted deflection was a fraction of a second too slow, and Damian's fist connected with his jaw with a sound like a baseball bat hitting a watermelon. Kenji's head snapped back, his body following in a graceless arc that ended with him crashing to the mat. He lay there for a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, his vision swimming, his ears ringing with the sound of impact and the sudden explosion of noise from the crowd. The arena erupted. Some spectators cheered wildly, caught up in the raw spectacle of violence. Others sat in stunned silence, processing what they'd just witnessed. The traditional martial artists looked on in horror, while the MMA fans pumped their fists and shouted encouragement. Damian stood over Kenji's prone form, his arms raised in triumph. "That's what I'm talking about," he shouted, playing to the cameras that were capturing every moment. "That's the difference between real fighting and playing dress-up." Master Saito was already moving, his elderly frame surprisingly quick as he rushed onto the mat. He knelt beside his student, checking for signs of serious injury, his weathered hands gentle as they examined Kenji's jaw and neck. "Kenji-kun," he whispered, his voice thick with concern. "Can you hear me?" The young man's eyes fluttered open, unfocused but aware. He tried to sit up, his aikido training making him instinctively bow even through his pain and confusion. "Sensei," he mumbled, his words slurred but determined. "I'm sorry. I failed you." "No," Master Saito said firmly, helping him to a sitting position. "You showed courage. You showed honor. That is never failure." But Damian wasn't finished. High on adrenaline and crowd approval, he strutted around the mat like a conquering hero. "You see this?" he shouted to the cameras. "This is what happens when fantasy meets reality. All these ancient arts, all this spiritual warrior nonsense, it's just a pretty way to get your ass kicked." Marco Diaz was in his element, his phone already uploading clips to social media, his voice carrying as he did impromptu interviews with anyone who would listen. "This is why Damian Vega is the future of martial arts," he proclaimed. "No bullshit, no pretense, just pure skill and power." In the crowd, the young students from local dojos watched with expressions ranging from shock to disgust. They had come to see a celebration of martial arts, but instead they were witnessing its degradation into mere brutality. Several of them were crying, their faith in the principles they'd been taught shaken by what they'd just seen. Emi Nakamura felt sick. Her camera had captured everything, but she found herself questioning whether she should even use the footage. "This isn't a story," she told her cameraman. "This is an assault. This is everything wrong with modern martial arts." But it was Steven Seagal's reaction that would change everything. The elderly Aikido master had watched the entire sequence. With the focused intensity of someone who had spent decades studying violence and its consequences, he had seen Kenji's courage, Damian's brutality, and the crowd's disturbing hunger for spectacle over substance. Slowly, deliberately, he rose from his seat. The movement was subtle, but it rippled through the VIP section like a stone dropped in still water. People turned to look, recognizing something in his posture that spoke of barely contained power. His face was calm, almost serene, but his dark eyes held the kind of intensity that came from someone who had reached the end of their patience. "Enough," he said quietly, his voice somehow carrying over the crowd noise. And then Steven Seagal began walking toward the mat. The arena's energy shifted like a sudden change in barometric pressure. Conversations died mid-sentence as people noticed the figure moving through the crowd with quiet, inexorable purpose. Steven Seagal walked not with the swagger of someone seeking confrontation, but with the measured gait of someone who had made a decision that could not be unmade. His movement had a ripple effect. Those who recognized him nudged their neighbors, whispers spreading through the crowd like wildfire. Smartphones appeared as people realized they were witnessing something unprecedented, The enigmatic action star and aikido master stepping into what had become a very real conflict. Damian was still basking in his victory, shadowboxing for the cameras and delivering increasingly bombastic soundbites to Marco's phone. "This is what real martial arts looks like," he proclaimed, his voice carrying across the arena. "Not some mystical bullshit, but actual skill meeting actual." He stopped mid-sentence as he noticed the change in the crowd's attention. Following their gaze, he saw Seagal approaching the mat, and his expression shifted from triumph to confusion, then to something approaching amusement. "Oh, this is rich," Damian said, his voice dripping with mock excitement. "The movie star wants to play hero. What's next? Are you going to cook me to death?" Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. His entourage laughed on cue, but the sound was hollow, forced. Even they could sense that something significant was happening, though they couldn't quite identify what. Seagal reached the edge of the mat and paused, his dark eyes taking in the scene with the kind of comprehensive awareness that came from decades of training. He saw Kenji, still sitting with Master Sato's help, a livid bruise already forming on his jaw. He saw the traditional martial artists in the crowd, their faces showing everything from anger to heartbreak. He saw the young students from local dojos, their faith in the principles they'd been taught shaken by what they'd witnessed. Then he looked at Damian, and something passed between them, a communication that went beyond words. It was the kind of look that predators gave each other, when territories overlapped, respectful but absolute. "Mr. Vega," Seagal said, his voice carrying the particular stillness that came from someone who had nothing left to prove. "I think you've misunderstood what just happened here." Damian's grin widened, feeding off what he interpreted as an easy target. "Oh, I understood perfectly. Kid came to fight. Kid got schooled. That's how the real world works, Grandpa." The dismissive tone sent a murmur through the crowd. Calling Steven Seagal Grandpa was like calling a sleeping volcano a pretty hill, technically accurate, but missing the point entirely. Seagal stepped onto the mat, his movement flowing like water despite his age. He was 71 years old, but he moved with the fluid precision of someone who had spent decades perfecting the art of movement. His black clothing seemed to absorb the arena's harsh lights, making him appear almost ethereal against the bright backdrop. "This isn't about me," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the arena despite its quiet tone. "This is about the path you just stepped off." Master Saito looked up from where he was tending to Kenji, his weathered face showing surprise and something approaching hope. He had known Seagal decades ago, when the American was just another foreign student seeking to understand the mysteries of Aikido. Seeing him now, Master Saito could recognize the same intensity that had driven the young man to excel, but tempered now by years of experience and wisdom. "Seagal-san," he said softly, a greeting that carried decades of respect and understanding. Seagal nodded once, then turned his attention back to Damian. "You came here to demonstrate your art, but what you showed wasn't martial arts. It was violence for its own sake." Damian's amusement was beginning to sour into something more aggressive. The crowd's attention was no longer entirely focused on him, and he could feel the narrative slipping away from his control. "Listen, old man," he said, his voice taking on the edge that had served him well in pre-fight interviews. "I don't know what kind of movie fantasy you're living in, but this is real life. That kid challenged me, and I showed him what happens when you step into the ring with a professional." "He's 15 years old," Seagal replied, his tone still conversational but carrying undertones of something far more dangerous. "And this was supposed to be a demonstration, not a fight." "Same difference," Damian shot back. "You can't coddle people forever. Sometimes they need to learn hard lessons." The crowd was growing restless, sensing that the conversation was building towards something significant. The cameras continued to roll, but the atmosphere had shifted from celebration to anticipation. This was no longer about sports or demonstrations. It was about something more fundamental. Seagal moved closer, his steps measured and deliberate. "The only lesson here is that power without wisdom is just another form of weakness." Damian's facade of amusement cracked entirely. "You want to test that theory, old man? Because I've got no problem showing you the same lesson I just taught your little friend." The challenge hung in the air like smoke, visible to everyone in the arena. Marco Diaz, sensing the potential for even more dramatic content, began filming. More aggressively, his phone capturing every nuance of the confrontation. "This is perfect," he whispered to his assistant. "Seagal versus Damian. The old guard versus the new. This is going to break the internet." But Seagal wasn't playing to the cameras. His attention was entirely focused on Damian, reading the younger man's body language with the expertise of someone who had spent decades studying human aggression. He could see the fighter's frustration, his need for validation, and underneath it all, the fear that drove him to seek dominance over others. "I'm not here to fight you," Seagal said, his voice carrying a note of finality. "I'm here to remind you of what you've forgotten." Damian's patience snapped. The crowd's attention, the cameras, the perceived slight to his reputation, it all crystallized into a white-hot need to prove himself. "You know what? Fine. Let's do this. You want to play the wise old master? Let's see how wise you are when you're eating, Matt." He began to circle Seagal, his movements taking on the predatory quality that had served him so well in the octagon. The crowd's energy spiked, sensing that violence was imminent. Some people began to leave, uncomfortable with the escalating confrontation, while others pressed closer, drawn by the spectacle. Seagal remained perfectly still, his feet planted, his hands at his sides. He watched Damian circling with the kind of patient attention that a spider might give to a fly testing the edges of its web. "This is your last chance to walk away," he said quietly. "Not because I'm afraid to fight, but because you're not ready for what comes next." The statement was so matter-of-fact, so devoid of bravado or threat, that it seemed to cut through the arena's noise like a blade. Damian stopped circling, his face flushing with anger and embarrassment. "Not ready?" he snarled. "I'm 23-0 in professional fights. I've never been beaten by anyone, anywhere. What makes you think some washed-up actor is going to?" He didn't finish the sentence. Instead, he exploded forward with all the speed and power that had made him famous, throwing a combination that had ended fights in the first round. But as his fist cut through the air where Seagal's head had been, the older man was already moving, and Damian found himself grasping at shadows. The demonstration was over. The real education was about to begin. The moment Damian launched his assault, the arena held its breath. His combination was textbook perfect, a jab to set up the cross, followed by a hook designed to catch his opponent off guard. These were the same strikes that had demolished professional fighters, turning promising careers into highlight reel memories. The speed was devastating, the power behind each punch enough to drop a heavyweight. But Steven Seagal was no longer where the punches were aimed. The aikido master had moved with such subtle economy that many in the crowd missed it entirely. One moment he was standing directly in Damian's path. The next he was 3 feet to the left, his feet having traced an almost imperceptible arc that took him completely out of danger. Damian's fists cut through empty air, his momentum carrying him forward into nothingness. "What the?" Damian began, but he was already spinning, trying to reacquire his target. Seagal hadn't moved far, just enough. His hands had barely shifted from their relaxed position at his sides, but somehow Damian's second combination met the same fate as the first. The younger fighter found himself punching shadows, his carefully timed attacks disrupted by an opponent who seemed to anticipate every movement. "Stand still," Damian snarled, frustration bleeding into his voice. Asterisk. The crowd was beginning to understand what they were witnessing. This wasn't the brutal exchange they'd expected. It was something far more subtle and, in its own way, more devastating. Seagal wasn't fighting Damian so much as he was demonstrating the futility of aggression without understanding. Emi Nakamura leaned forward, her camera capturing every nuance. "Do you see this?" she whispered to her cameraman. "He's not even trying to hurt him. He's teaching." On the mat, Damian's attacks were becoming increasingly desperate. He threw a leg kick that would have crippled most opponents, but Seagal simply wasn't there when it arrived. A spinning back fist that had ended 3 of his professional fights whistled harmlessly past Seagal's ear. Each miss seemed to feed his frustration, making his next attack even more reckless. "Fight me," Damian shouted, sweat beginning to bead on his forehead despite the brief duration of the exchange. "Stop running and fight." Seagal's response was almost conversational. "I'm not running. I'm listening." The statement confused Damian enough that he paused, giving Seagal his first opening. The older man's hand moved with liquid smoothness, not to strike, but to redirect. When Damian threw his next punch, Seagal's palm met his wrist at exactly the right angle, turning the attack into a gentle spiral that left the younger fighter off balance and vulnerable. For just a moment, Seagal could have ended the confrontation. Damian was completely exposed, his center compromised, his weight distributed all wrong. A simple push would have sent him to the mat. Instead, Seagal stepped back, allowing Damian to recover his balance. "You're strong," Seagal said, his voice carrying no mockery. But strength without direction is just noise. The crowd was beginning to shift, their bloodlust giving way to something approaching awe. Even those who had come to see Damian demolish another opponent were starting to realize they were witnessing something extraordinary. This wasn't a fight, it was a masterclass in control. Master Saito, still tending to Kenji at the edge of the mat, watched with tears in his eyes. He remembered the young American who had come to his dojo decades ago, hungry to understand the deeper mysteries of aikido. That student had possessed raw talent but lacked patience. Seeing him now, Saito could recognize the decades of refinement that had transformed natural ability into something approaching art. "Beautiful," he whispered. He has finally understood. Damian, meanwhile, was growing increasingly frantic. His reputation, his career, his entire sense of self-worth was tied up in his ability to dominate opponents through physical superiority. But Seagal was making him look foolish without even seeming to try. Every attack was met with minimal effort. Every combination dissolved into uselessness. "This is bullshit," Damian exploded, abandoning technique entirely. He rushed forward like an angry bull, hands swinging wildly, hoping to overwhelm Seagal through sheer aggression. It was exactly what Seagal had been waiting for. The moment Damian committed to his reckless charge, Seagal moved. Not away this time, but toward him, stepping into the chaos with perfect timing. His hand found Damian's lead wrist, his body positioning itself along the line of attack. What happened next was so smooth, so natural, that it looked almost choreographed. Damian's momentum became Seagal's ally. The older man's subtle adjustment to the fighter's trajectory sent him spinning past his target, his own force working against him. By the time Damian realized what was happening, he was already falling, his body following a path that Seagal had chosen for him. He hit the mat hard, his breath exploding from his lungs in a sharp gasp. The arena fell silent except for the sound of his labored breathing and the soft whisper of Seagal's footsteps as he positioned himself nearby. "Yield," Seagal said quietly, the word carrying absolute authority. Damian lay on his back, staring up at the arena lights, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. He was supposed to be the aggressor, the dominant force. But somehow, this elderly man had made him feel like a child throwing a tantrum. "I said yield," Seagal repeated, his voice still calm but carrying undertones of steel. For a moment, something flickered in Damian's eyes, not anger, but confusion. Perhaps even the beginning of understanding. He had expected a brawl, a test of strength and speed and endurance. Instead, he had encountered something he didn't have words for. Power that came not from muscle but from mastery. Dominance that came not from aggression but from perfect control. The crowd waited, sensing that this moment balanced on a knife's edge. Would Damian learn from what had just happened, or would his ego demand that he continue the futile struggle? Damian's chest rose and fell with rapid, shallow breaths as he stared up at the arena's harsh lights. The mat beneath him felt cold against his back, a stark contrast to the burning humiliation that spread through his body like poison. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. He was the predator, the apex fighter who had never met his match. Yet here he was, flat on his back, put there by a man old enough to be his grandfather. "Get up," he whispered to himself, his voice barely audible. "Get up and show them what you're made of." Seagal stood nearby, his posture relaxed but alert, like a teacher waiting for a student to process a difficult lesson. He had positioned himself close enough to respond if Damian chose to continue, but far enough away to give the younger man space to make his choice. "This doesn't have to continue," Seagal said, his voice carrying the particular gentleness that comes from strength that doesn't need to prove itself. "You can walk away from this with your dignity intact." But dignity was exactly what Damian felt slipping away with every passing second. The crowd's energy had shifted from excitement to something approaching pity, and he could feel their judgment like physical weight. His phone, somewhere in Marco's hands, was probably broadcasting his humiliation to millions of followers who had come to expect dominance, not defeat. "No," he said, rolling to his side and pushing himself up on one elbow. "No, this isn't over." The movement sent a wave of dizziness through his head, not from any injury, but from the psychological shock of being so completely outmaneuvered. He had built his entire identity around being untouchable, unstoppable. Seagal had made him look like an amateur. "I'm not done," Damian continued, getting to his feet with the unsteady determination of someone fighting their own body's warnings. "You got lucky. That's all." Seagal's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes suggested disappointment rather than surprise. He had given Damian an opportunity to learn, to grow, to choose wisdom over ego. The younger man was choosing to waste it. "Very well," Seagal said simply. This time, when Damian attacked, there was no technique left in him. The precision that had made him a champion was gone, replaced by desperate fury. He swung like a street brawler, all power and no finesse, hoping to land something, anything, that would salvage his reputation. Seagal met the assault with the same patient precision he had shown before, but now there was something different in his movement, a subtle shift from teaching to correction. When Damian threw a wild haymaker, Seagal didn't just evade it. He guided it past its target and used the momentum to send Damian stumbling forward. When the fighter tried to grab him in a desperate clinch, Seagal broke the grip with a movement so small it was almost invisible, leaving Damian grasping at air. "Stand still and fight me," Damian screamed, his voice cracking with frustration. "I am fighting you," Seagal replied calmly. "This is what real fighting looks like." The next exchange lasted only seconds, but to those watching, it felt like an eternity. Damian threw everything he had left: punches, kicks, elbows, knees, in a frenzied combination that would have overwhelmed any normal opponent. But Seagal moved through the chaos like water flowing around stones, each attack meeting nothing but empty space while he positioned himself for what everyone could sense was coming. When it happened, it was so quick that the cameras barely caught it. Damian, exhausted and off balance from his wild assault, threw one final, desperate punch. Seagal stepped inside the arc of the attack, his hand finding Damian's wrist, his body positioning itself along the natural line of force. For a moment, the two men were connected in perfect geometry, Damian's aggression meeting Seagal's redirection in a way that seemed almost inevitable. Then Damian was airborne. The throw, if it could even be called that, was beautiful in its simplicity. Seagal had used nothing but Damian's own momentum and a subtle shift in direction to send the fighter sailing through the air. There was no visible effort, no dramatic technique, just the natural consequence of force meeting perfect positioning. Damian hit the mat with a sound like thunder, his body bouncing once before settling into stillness. This time, he didn't get up immediately. He lay there, staring at the ceiling, his chest heaving as he struggled to process what had just happened to him. The arena was completely silent now. Even the MMA fans who had been cheering for blood were quiet, sensing that they had witnessed something beyond mere combat. This hadn't been a fight. It had been a lesson in humility delivered with surgical precision. Seagal stood over Damian, his expression neither triumphant nor cruel. If anything, he looked sad, like a parent watching a child learn a painful but necessary lesson. "Yield," he said again, the word carrying the weight of finality. Damian's eyes darted around the arena, taking in the faces of the crowd, the cameras that were recording his defeat, the young martial artists who were watching his every move. He could see it all: the viral videos that would follow, the memes, the slow erosion of everything he had built. His undefeated record would remain intact in the official books, but everyone would know the truth. He began, his voice barely a whisper. "There's no shame in learning," Seagal said quietly, extending his hand toward the fallen fighter. "Only in refusing to." For a moment, Damian stared at the offered hand as if it were a foreign object. Help from an opponent, respect from someone who had just dismantled everything he thought he knew about fighting. It was so far outside his experience that he didn't know how to respond. Then, slowly, he reached up and took it. The moment Damian's hand clasped Seagal's, something shifted in the arena's atmosphere. The older man's grip was firm but gentle, pulling the younger fighter to his feet with the kind of care typically reserved for someone you were trying to heal, not defeat. Damian stood unsteadily, his legs shaking not from physical exhaustion, but from the psychological aftermath of having his entire worldview challenged. "I don't understand," Damian said, his voice raw with confusion and something approaching desperation. "How did you? I mean, you're 70 years old. I'm in my prime. This doesn't make sense." Seagal released his hand but remained close, his presence somehow both non-threatening and absolutely commanding. "Age is just time," he said quietly. "What matters is what you do with that time. I've spent 50 years learning to master myself, not just my opponents." The crowd remained hushed, sensing they were witnessing something rare, the moment when ego encounters wisdom and begins to crack. Even Marco had stopped his constant commentary, his phone hanging forgotten at his side as he watched his fighter grapple with concepts that couldn't be monetized or hashtagged. Damian's eyes darted around the arena, taking in the faces that surrounded him. The traditional martial artists watched with expressions of quiet satisfaction, not because they enjoyed his humiliation, but because they recognized justice being served. The young students from local dojos looked on with wide eyes, seeing their beliefs validated in real time. Even some of the MMA fans seemed subdued, processing what they had witnessed. "You made me look like a fool," Damian said, the words emerging somewhere between accusation and admission. "No," Seagal replied, his tone carrying no mockery. "You did that yourself. I just provided the mirror." The statement hit Damian like a physical blow. He had spent years building an image of invincibility, surrounding himself with people who told him what he wanted to hear, crafting a persona that was all swagger and no substance. Now, in front of thousands of people and countless cameras, that facade had been stripped away to reveal the frightened, insecure child underneath. "So what now?" Damian asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Everyone's going to see this. My career, my reputation." "Your reputation was built on hurting people weaker than you," Seagal said, not unkindly, but with absolute clarity. "Is that really worth preserving?" The question hung in the air like incense, heavy with implications. Damian found himself thinking about his journey, the poverty he'd escaped, the violence he'd embraced, the way he'd turned his pain into a weapon against others. Somewhere along the way, he had convinced himself that dominance was the same as strength, that fear was the same as respect. From the edge of the mat, Kenji watched the exchange with fascination. The young aikidoka had recovered enough to sit up properly, though his jaw still throbbed from Damian's punch. But the physical pain was secondary to what he was witnessing. A masterclass in the kind of strength he had been training to develop his entire life. "Sensei," he whispered to Master Saito, "is this what you meant when you talked about true victory?" The old man nodded, his eyes never leaving the two figures on the mat. "Victory over an opponent is temporary. Victory over yourself is eternal." Damian, meanwhile, was struggling with the most difficult opponent he had ever faced, his own. Reflection. The man standing before him hadn't used superior strength or speed or technique in any traditional sense. Instead, Seagal had simply shown him the futility of his approach, the emptiness of aggression without purpose. "I don't know how to be anything else," Damian admitted, the words escaping before he could stop them. "Fighting is all I know. Winning is all I have." "Then learn something new," Seagal said simply. "The path of the warrior isn't about conquering others. It's about conquering the parts of yourself that make you want to." The arena remained silent as Damian processed this. His entire identity had been built around being the predator, the alpha, the one who took what he wanted through force. The concept of strength through restraint, power through wisdom, was so foreign to his experience that he didn't have words for it. "How?" he asked finally, the question emerging like a prayer. Instead of answering directly, Seagal turned slightly toward Master Saito and Kenji. "Look at them," he said quietly. "The old man who has spent his life teaching others to be better than they were. The young man who chose honor over victory, discipline over ego. That's what strength looks like." Damian followed his gaze, seeing the traditional martial artists not as weak prey, but as something he had never recognized before. People who had chosen a harder path than his own. It would have been easier for Master Saito to teach brutal techniques, to focus on dominance rather than harmony. It would have been easier for Kenji to quit after being hurt, to abandon his principles in favor of revenge. There is no honor in defeating you, Seagal continued, his voice carrying across the silent arena. Only in helping you find yours. The words hit Damian with more force than any physical blow ever had. All his life, he had measured himself against others, defining his worth by their defeat. The concept of internal victory, of becoming better than he had been rather than better than his opponents, was revolutionary. I've hurt people, Damian said, the admission dragging itself from somewhere deep inside him. I've made a career out of it. How do you come back from that? One step at a time, Seagal replied. One choice at a time. One moment of choosing to be better than you were. The crowd was beginning to stir, sensing that the confrontation was winding down. But the energy wasn't the same as it had been. Instead of bloodlust satisfied, there was something approaching reverence. They had come to see a fight, but they had witnessed a transformation. Emi Nakamura raised her microphone, her journalist instincts telling her this was the story of a lifetime. But as she looked at Damian's face, raw, vulnerable, stripped of all pretense, she found herself hesitating. Some moments were too sacred to interrupt. Instead, she lowered the microphone and simply watched as two men, one old, one young, one wise, one learning, stood together on a mat where violence had been transformed into understanding. The real fight was just beginning, but for the first time in his life, Damian Vega was ready for it. The Tokyo Convention Center's harsh fluorescent lights had somehow softened in the aftermath of the confrontation, casting everything in a gentler glow that seemed to match the subdued mood of the crowd. The immediate rush of adrenaline and spectacle had faded, leaving behind something more complex, a sense that everyone present had witnessed something that would take time to fully understand. Emi Nakamura stood at the edge of the media scrum that had formed around the mat, her microphone held loosely in her hand. The other reporters were shouting questions, angling for sound bites and viral quotes, but she found herself studying the scene with different eyes. This wasn't just another sports story. It was something deeper, more fundamental about human nature and the possibility of change. Mr. Seagal, one reporter called out, thrusting a camera toward the aikido master. What was going through your mind when you decided to step in? Seagal paused before answering, his dark eyes scanning the crowd of journalists with the same patient attention he had shown on the mat. I saw a young man who had forgotten what martial arts was supposed to teach him, he said finally. Sometimes we all need reminders. And Mr. Vega, another reporter pressed, how does it feel to be beaten by someone twice your age? Damian stood slightly apart from the crowd, his usual swagger completely absent. His training clothes were wrinkled and sweat-stained, but it was his expression that marked the real change. Where there had once been cocky confidence, there was now something raw and uncertain, like someone seeing the world clearly for the first time. I wasn't beaten, he said quietly, the words causing a ripple of confusion through the assembled media. I was educated. Marco Diaz pushed through the crowd, his face flushed with a mixture of panic and calculation. His golden goose had just laid an egg of humility instead of the aggressive content that drove their brand. What Damian means, he began, but the fighter cut him off with a gesture. No, Damian said firmly. I mean what I said. I came here thinking I was going to show everyone how tough I was. Instead, I learned how much I still have to learn. The admission sent another wave of murmurs through the crowd. This wasn't the kind of post-fight interview anyone had expected. Professional fighters were supposed to make excuses, demand rematches, maintain their image even in defeat. Damian was doing something unprecedented, telling the truth. Near the medical station that had been set up for Kenji, Master Saito watched the proceedings with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had lived long enough to appreciate rare moments of grace. His student sat beside him, an ice pack pressed to his jaw, but his eyes bright with understanding. Sensei, Kenji said softly, did you know this would happen when you agreed to the demonstration? The old master smiled, the expression creasing, his weathered face into familiar lines. I knew that truth has a way of revealing itself when the stakes are high enough. I did not know how, only that it would. And Seagal-san? He has found his way back to what made him great in the first place. Hollywood fame is temporary. Character is eternal. As if sensing their conversation, Seagal made his way through the crowd toward them. The reporters followed, but he moved with the kind of purpose that discouraged interruption. When he reached the medical station, he bowed deeply to Master Saito, not the casual nod of recognition from earlier, but the formal bow of a student to his teacher. Saito-sensei, he said in careful Japanese, I hope my actions today honored the lessons you taught me long ago. The old man's eyes misted slightly as he returned the bow. You remembered what matters most. That is all any teacher can hope for. Then Seagal turned to Kenji, studying the young man's bruised but determined face. How are you feeling? Honored, Seagal-san. Kenji replied without hesitation. Honored to have been part of something important. You were brave out there. Your technique was sound, your spirit unbroken. That matters more than any victory. Meanwhile, Damian had extracted himself from the crowd of reporters and was slowly making his way toward the small group. His movements were hesitant, uncertain, like someone approaching a place they weren't sure they belonged. When he reached them, he stopped at what he judged to be a respectful distance. Excuse me, he said, his voice carrying none of its earlier bravado. I wanted to apologize. Master Saito looked up at him with the kind of gentle attention that made people want to confess their deepest secrets. For what, young man? For hurting your student? For disrespecting your art? For being everything wrong with martial arts today? The old master was quiet for a long moment, studying Damian's face with the patience of someone who had spent decades learning to see beyond surface appearances. Do you know what the word Budo means? He asked finally. Damian shook his head. It means the way of stopping conflict. Not winning it, stopping it. You have great physical skill, but skill without wisdom is just elaborate violence. I don't know how to be wise, Damian admitted. I only know how to fight. Then perhaps it is time to learn something new. Master Sato's words carried the weight of genuine invitation, and Damian felt something shift inside his chest. A crack in the armor of cynicism and aggression that had protected him for so long. Could you teach me? Teaching is not something that happens in one day, or 1 week, or even 1 year, the old man replied. It is a lifetime commitment. Are you prepared for that? Damian looked around at the faces surrounding him, Seagal's knowing eyes, Kenji's earnest expression, Master Sato's patient wisdom. For the first time in years, he felt something he had almost forgotten. Hope. I'd like to try, he said simply. Master Saito nodded slowly. Then, you may visit our dojo. We train every Tuesday and Thursday evening, Saturday morning. Come as a student, not as a champion. Leave your ego at the door. I will, Damian promised. Thank you. As the crowd began to disperse and the arena slowly emptied, Emi Nakamura finally raised her microphone for one last question. But instead of addressing it to any of the principals, she spoke to her camera. Today we came expecting to see a fight, she said, her voice carrying clearly in the sudden quiet. Instead, we witnessed something far more rare, the moment when someone chose to become better than they were. The real victory wasn't decided on the mat. It was decided in the choice to grow, to learn, to humble ourselves before something greater than our own ego. She paused, looking around at the nearly empty arena where folding chairs sat in neat rows, and the smell of sweat and ambition still lingered in the air. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is admit you have something to learn. And sometimes the greatest teacher is the one who shows you your weakness so you can transform it into strength. The camera stopped rolling, but the story was just beginning. The Saito Dojo occupied the second floor of a modest building in Tokyo's Shibuya district, squeezed between a convenience store and a small restaurant that served traditional udon. Unlike the flashy commercial gyms that dominated the modern martial arts landscape, this place carried the quiet dignity of something that had endured for decades without compromise. The wooden floors bore the scuff marks of countless feet. The walls were lined with faded photographs of students from generations past, and the air held the distinctive scent of old wood and honest sweat. A week had passed since the Expo confrontation, and the viral videos had done exactly what Marco Diaz had predicted. They had broken the internet, but not in the way he had expected. Instead of celebrating Damian's dominance over a traditional martial artist, the online narrative had focused on his subsequent humbling by Steven Seagal and, more importantly, his apparent transformation afterward. Hashtag Real Martial Arts was trending, with millions of views and thousands of comments debating the nature of strength, wisdom, and what it meant to be a true warrior. Damian stood outside the dojo's entrance, his hand hovering over the doorbell. He had traded his usual designer athletic wear for simple black pants and a plain white t-shirt, the closest thing he owned to traditional training clothes. His expensive car was parked 3 blocks away. He had walked the final distance, using the time to prepare himself mentally for what lay ahead. The decision to come here hadn't been easy. His management team had been split between damage control and opportunity recognition. Some wanted him to disappear until the controversy died down, while others saw potential in marketing his spiritual journey. Damian had listened to their arguments for exactly 5 minutes before telling them all to shut up and leave him alone to think. He pressed the doorbell. Master Saito himself answered the door, moving with the same fluid grace that had characterized every interaction Damian had witnessed. The old man was dressed in a traditional gi, his silver hair neatly combed, his expression carrying neither judgment nor excessive welcome, just the neutral attention of someone prepared to evaluate a new student. Vega-san, he said with a slight bow. You came. I said I would. Damian replied, then caught himself. I mean, yes, sensei. Thank you for allowing me to visit. Words are wind. We will see what your actions reveal. Please, remove your shoes and follow me. The main training area was larger than it had appeared from outside, with mirrors along one wall and traditional calligraphy scrolls decorating the others. About a dozen students were already present, ranging in age from 8 to 60, all wearing the white gi and colored belts that indicated their level of training. They moved through basic forms with quiet concentration, their breathing synchronized, their movements reflecting years of careful instruction. Damian's entrance created a subtle ripple of awareness through the group. Most of them recognized him from the viral videos, but their reactions were muted, respectful. This was sacred space, and even celebrity drama was secondary to the work at hand. Everyone, Master Saito called softly, and the students immediately stopped their practice and turned to face him. We have a visitor today. Vega-san has come to learn about aikido. He will observe first, then perhaps participate if he shows proper attitude. The phrasing was deliberate. Not Damian Vega, the famous fighter, but simply Vega-san, a person asking to learn. Several of the younger students whispered among themselves until a sharp look from their instructor restored silence. Kenji emerged from the changing area, his jaw still showing faint bruising from their encounter, but his movements confident and pain-free. When he saw Damian, he paused for just a moment, then approached and offered a formal bow. Vega-san, he said, quietly, welcome to our dojo. The simple gesture, respect offered without conditions, forgiveness given without being asked, hit Damian harder than any punch ever had. Kenji-kun, he replied, attempting to return the bow with appropriate depth. I owe you an apology. What I did was wrong. What matters is what you do moving forward. Kenji replied with wisdom that seemed far beyond his 15 years. Sensei taught me that the past is for learning, not for living in. Master Saito clapped his hands once, drawing everyone's attention. Enough talking. Training begins. Vega-san, you will sit and observe. Watch not just the techniques, but the spirit behind them. For the next hour, Damian witnessed something he had never imagined existed. The students moved through their practice with a harmony that seemed almost choreographed, but he gradually realized it was something deeper, a shared understanding of principles that went beyond individual technique. When they practiced throws, the person being thrown cooperated, learning to fall safely, while their partner learned to redirect force with minimum effort. When they worked on strikes, the emphasis was on precision and control rather than power. And damage. Why don't they try to hurt each other? Damian found himself asking during a brief water break. Master Saito settled beside him on the bench, his ancient knees creaking slightly. Because the purpose is not to defeat your partner, but to help them improve. In aikido, your opponent is your teacher, and your teacher is your opponent. How can you learn if you destroy your source of knowledge? The concept was so foreign to everything Damian had been taught that he struggled to process it. In his world, training partners were obstacles to overcome, competition for limited resources, and recognition. The idea of genuinely wanting someone else to improve even at the cost of making them better able to challenge you. Made no sense from a strategic standpoint. But how do you know if you're really getting better? He asked. How do you measure progress? Against yesterday's version of yourself, came a familiar voice from behind them. Damian turned to see Steven Seagal entering the dojo, dressed in simple black clothing and moving with the same quiet authority he had displayed at the Expo. Several of the students bowed respectfully as he passed, but there was no fanfare, no disruption of the ongoing practice. Seagal-san, Master Saito said, rising to greet his former student. I hoped you might visit before returning to America. I wanted to see how our young friend was adapting, Seagal replied, his dark eyes settling on Damian with the same patient intensity from their previous encounter. Damian felt himself tense involuntarily, muscle memory from their confrontation, making him want to prepare for conflict. But Seagal's presence carried no threat, only the calm attention of someone observing a student's progress. Stand up, Seagal said quietly. Let me see what you've learned. But I haven't learned anything yet, Damian protested. I've just been watching. Watching is learning. Now show me. With the entire dojo's attention focused on him, Damian rose uncertainly. He had no idea what was expected of him, no framework for understanding what showing might mean in this context. In his world, demonstrating skill meant displaying power, speed, aggression. But those tools seemed not just inappropriate, but actively counterproductive here. Approach me, Seagal instructed. But come as a student, not as a fighter. Damian took a step forward, then another, his movements awkward with self-consciousness. Every instinct screamed at him to maintain distance, to keep his hands up, to prepare for combat. But something in Seagal's demeanor suggested that such preparations would be missing the point entirely. When he was within arm's reach, Seagal placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. What do you feel? The question caught Damian off guard. I don't understand. Your body is tense, your breathing is shallow, your mind is preparing for conflict that doesn't exist. This is how you approach the world, as if everything is a threat to be overcome. But what if it isn't? Seagal's hand remained on his shoulder, not gripping or controlling, just maintaining contact. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Damian felt some of the tension begin to drain from his muscles. Better, Seagal said approvingly. The first lesson of aikido is learning to be present without being aggressive. You cannot redirect what you cannot feel, and you cannot feel what you are too tense to perceive. The simple exercise continued for several more minutes, with Seagal guiding Damian through basic concepts of posture, breathing, and awareness. To an outside observer, it might have looked like nothing was happening, just two men standing close together, moving slowly and quietly. But for Damian, it was a revelation. For the first time in his adult life, he was learning to be physically present with another person without planning how to hurt them. Enough for today, Master Saito announced as the formal training session concluded. Vega-san, you are welcome to return on Thursday if you wish to continue learning. Damian bowed clumsily, but sincerely. Thank you, Sensei. I will be here. As the students began to file out, changing from their training clothes back into the garments of everyday life, Damian found himself reluctant to leave. There was something about this place, these people, that felt like the answer to a question he hadn't known he was asking. Seagal-san, he said as the older man prepared to depart. At the Expo, you said I had stepped off the path. How do I find my way back? Seagal paused, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. The path was never lost, he said finally. You simply stopped looking for it. Now you're looking again. That's the first step, and sometimes the hardest. With that, he bowed once more to Master Saito and quietly left, leaving Damian alone, with questions that would take much longer than one evening to answer. 6 months later, the landscape of Damian Vega's life had changed in ways that would have been unimaginable to the man who had strutted onto the Expo mat with such arrogant confidence. The transformation hadn't been sudden or dramatic. There had been no magical moment of enlightenment, no instant conversion from aggression to wisdom. Instead, it had been a gradual process of erosion and rebuilding, like a river slowly carving new channels through ancient stone. The Saito Dojo had become his second home. 3 evenings a week, he would arrive in his simple training clothes, bow respectfully at the entrance, and spend 2 hours learning to unlearn everything he thought he knew about strength and power. Master Saito proved to be a patient, but demanding. Teacher, pushing Damian to examine not just his physical techniques, but the mental and spiritual foundations that informed them. Your body remembers violence, the old master had told him during one particularly frustrating session. Every muscle, every reflex, every instinct has been trained to hurt and dominate. We must teach it a new language, but first we must convince it to forget the old one. The process was more difficult than any physical training Damian had ever endured. Learning to receive an attack without immediately counterattacking went against every survival instinct he had developed. Learning to help his training partners improve, even when they were struggling with techniques he had already mastered, challenged his fundamental understanding of competition. Most difficult of all was learning to measure his progress not against others, but against his previous self, to find satisfaction in becoming more peaceful rather than more dangerous. His professional career had taken an unexpected turn. Marco Diaz had eventually fired him, unable to reconcile the fighter's new philosophy with the aggressive brand they had built together. But other opportunities had emerged: speaking engagements at martial arts schools, guest instructor positions at traditional dojos, even a documentary project following his journey from MMA dominance to aikido humility. The irony, he told a reporter during one such interview, is that I'm more famous now for losing than I ever was for winning. But it's a different kind of fame. People aren't interested in my highlight reels anymore. They want to know how someone can change their fundamental nature. The most profound changes, however, were visible in smaller moments. The way he interacted with service staff at restaurants, patience instead of entitlement. His response to traffic jams, acceptance instead of rage. His approach to disagreements, curiosity instead of combat. These shifts were noticed first by those closest to him, then gradually by everyone who encountered him. Kenji had become an unexpected friend and, in some ways, a teacher. The teenager's natural wisdom and genuine humility had shown Damian what true strength looked like. They often trained together now, with Kenji helping the former professional fighter understand subtleties of technique that had nothing to do with physical prowess and everything to do with spiritual development. At first, I was terrified of you, Kenji admitted during one of their conversations after training. You represented everything I'd been taught to avoid: aggression, ego, the desire to dominate. But now I see that you were just lost, like all of us sometimes. I was worse than lost, Damian replied, carefully folding his GI in the precise manner Master Saito had taught him. I was proud of being lost. I thought my confusion was clarity, my aggression was strength. That's what made it so dangerous. The young Aikidoka nodded thoughtfully. Sensei says that the most dangerous people are those who confuse violence with power. But the most hopeful people are those who learn the difference. This evening's training session had been particularly challenging. Master Saito had introduced a new concept, randori, or free-form practice, where multiple attackers would approach simultaneously and the defender would need to blend with all of them harmoniously. For someone trained in MMA, where the goal was to isolate and defeat opponents one at a time, the Aikido approach of redirecting multiple attacks while keeping everyone safe was almost incomprehensibly complex. I keep trying to fight them, Damian said, frustration evident in his voice as he bowed off the mat after yet another failed attempt. Because you still see them as enemies to be defeated, Master Saito replied calmly. But in Aikido, there are no enemies, only people who have temporarily forgotten their true nature. Your job is not to beat them, but to remind them. As the formal training session concluded, Emi Nakamura entered the dojo. The journalist had been documenting Damian's journey for her upcoming book about transformation in modern martial arts. Her presence had become familiar to the regular students, and she had earned their respect through her genuine interest in understanding rather than simply reporting. How are you feeling about your upcoming return to competition? She asked, settling into Saiza beside Damian as the dojo gradually emptied. The question referred to an upcoming charity exhibition match that Damian had agreed to participate in, his first formal competition since the Expo incident. The event was designed to raise money for underprivileged youth martial arts programs, and he would be facing a respected MMA veteran in what was being billed as a philosophy versus technique showcase. Nervous, Damian admitted. 6 months ago, I would have been planning how to hurt my opponent, how to make him quit, how to make the crowd cheer for my dominance. Now, I'm not sure what I'm supposed to do. What does Master Saito say? He says to remember that my opponent is also my teacher and that the real victory is in demonstrating what I've learned, not in proving what I can do to someone else. Emmy nodded, making notes in her small pad. And what have you learned? Damian was quiet for a long moment, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. Around them, the dojo was settling into its evening stillness, the last students, changing clothes and preparing to return to their lives outside these walls. I've learned that strength without wisdom is just another form of weakness, he said finally. I've learned that the hardest person to defeat is yourself, and that the greatest victory is choosing not to fight at all when fighting isn't necessary. Do you miss it? The old way of being? Sometimes, he admitted. It was simpler, clearer. You had enemies, you defeated them, you moved on to the next challenge. But it was also empty. All that power, all that success, and I was still just a scared kid from Chicago trying to prove he was worth something. Through the dojo's large windows, the lights of Tokyo stretched out like fallen stars, millions of people living their lives, pursuing their dreams, struggling with their own demons. Damian found himself thinking about all the young fighters in gyms around the world, training themselves to hurt others in the pursuit of validation, money, fame. How many of them were following the same path he had walked, mistaking aggression for strength, domination for success? There's something I want to show you, Master Saito said, approaching them with a folded piece of paper in his hands. This arrived today. The letter was from Seagal, written on simple stationery in careful handwriting. Damian-san, I have been following your progress through Master Sato's reports. Your transformation reminds me why I began studying martial arts 40 years ago, not to become a better fighter, but to become a better human being. The path you have chosen is difficult, and it will never truly end. There will always be more to learn, more ways to grow, more opportunities to choose wisdom over ego. But that is what makes it worthwhile. Remember that mastery of the mat is nothing without mastery of your heart. You have begun to understand this truth. Now you must live it, day by day, choice by choice, for the rest of your life. The real victory was never about defeating others. It was about becoming worthy of the power you were given. With respect, Seagal. Damian read the letter twice, feeling something warm and unfamiliar expand in his chest. It was recognition, validation, but not the kind he had spent years craving. This was deeper, acknowledgement from someone whose opinion actually mattered, whose respect had to be earned through character rather than purchased through fear. He's right, Damian said quietly, folding the letter carefully. The real fight isn't in the octagon. It's in here. He tapped his chest, over his heart. As Emmy packed up her equipment and prepared to leave, Damian remained sitting in Seiza, his eyes closed, his breathing deep and regular. The transformation that had begun on a stage in front of thousands of people was continuing here, in the quiet of an empty dojo, one breath at a time. Outside, Tokyo hummed with its endless energy, but inside the Saito dojo, a former champion was learning the most difficult lesson of all: how to be strong enough to be gentle, powerful enough to be peaceful, and secure enough in his own worth to help others find theirs. The boy who had fought his way out of Chicago's streets was gone. In his place sat a man still learning, still growing, still discovering what it meant to be truly strong. And for the first time in his life, Damian Vega was exactly where he belonged. Up next, we have two more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.